Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to analyze Chelsea's balance out in the wider areas that helped Hakim Ziyech produce a man-of-the-match performance to unlock Sheffield United's defense. When we break down the game and we do look at the board, we have Chelsea in a 4-3-3 and Sheffield United in a 3-5-2 that ultimately dropped off into a 5-3-2 as they took an early lead. So when we assess Sheffield United, what we end up seeing is that they did drop off into a deeper low block once they took the lead, and Lampard's men were tasked with breaking down a very organized Sheffield side if they wanted to claim all 3 points. If we quickly look at Sheffield United's shape, what you end up seeing is that Brewster and McGoldrick would drop off the center backs and block off the passing lanes into N'Golo Kanté to ensure that Sheffield United were able to cope in that midfield zone. That meant that it was Lundstrom against Kovacic and Berge against Mount, and then they had Norwood as a holder providing cover if you had the Sheffield United shuttlers shifting out to close down Chilwell or Reece James. Because they're shifted out into a 5-3-2 and you have Ziyech and Werner out in high positions, that means that Lundstrom and Berge are tasked to close down the Chelsea fullbacks so that Baldock and Lowe can deal with Ziyech and Werner. But with Chris Wilder's side dropping off into that 5-3-2, that means that the midfield zone is congested. You have 6 Sheffield United players occupying that center of the pitch, and it would be logical for Chelsea to play out into the wider areas. However, last season, Sheffield United were able to cope with that threat successfully because they had the shuttlers shifting out into those wider areas, and they had Norwood also helping out to provide cover. That means that you often have 3 or 4 Sheffield United players closing down those wide areas, and that presented several issues for the opposing sides. Nevertheless, this made Lampard's tactical approach very interesting, because when you look at that Chelsea starting lineup, out in the wider areas, they aren't playing with conventional wingers. Werner's technically a wide forward that wants to break into central positions in behind, so you often saw him positioned ahead of Basham or in the gap between Baldock and Basham. Meanwhile, you have Ziyech on the right-hand side, who is more of an inverted creative player, and he's also looking to tuck in narrow. The significant variation in Lampard's setup featured the central midfielders. You had Kanté deeper ahead of the center backs, which meant that the fullbacks had space to push forward, but it was Mount and Kovacic's positioning that signified how Chelsea were going to attack down either flank. When we focus on Mason Mount, he was often dropping off deeper in an inside left position, and that would pull out Berge, but it allowed Chilwell to push forward to peg back Baldock. While it should be stated that Mount and Kovacic initially started in between the gaps of Norwood and Berge and Norwood and Lundstrom, Mount often dropped off into that deeper position, and what we ended up seeing from Mount in that left-sided position was that when he would look to receive the ball, there were times where you had Ziyech shifting from a wider position just across low to drag him narrow, and then that created space for James to push forward down the right channel because Lundstrom was helping that Sheffield United midfield protect the center of the pitch. And then when you look at that right-hand side, what we end up seeing was that Ziyech was occupying low, and Kovacic was pushing beyond that Lundstrom-Norwood gap to advanced positions to occupy Stevens. This creates space for James to push forward or often be the reference point for Chelsea to start attacks because they're able to switch the play out to him and drag out those Sheffield United players. Lundstrom is protecting the center of the pitch with Norwood as Berge steps out to Mount. Now, technically, in that opening half, when the ball is shifted out to James, Lundstrom should be shifting out to provide cover. But what we often saw was that Lowe would leave Ziyech to push into the path of James, and then that creates that 2v1 with Kovacic occupying Stevens. But in the opening stages of that game, it appeared that Chilwell would be the creative linchpin for Chelsea. When we look to the first example, we witness how both sides of the pitch were able to influence the game. You have Chilwell pulling out Berge and clipping a lofted ball into Tammy Abraham, who's positioned between Stevens and Egan. As Abraham chests the ball down and receives time to turn to face goal, this is where you see Kovacic running beyond Lundstrom to occupy Stevens. And although a recovering Norwood does take out Abraham, the Chelsea center forward is able to slide the ball across Lundstrom for Ziyech, who is now in a 2v1 with James overlapping beyond Lowe. And when Ziyech plays in the overlapping James, his first time low fizz ball evades Stevens, but Abraham attacks it ahead of Egan at the front post. At that moment, you could see Chilwell free at the back post with Werner occupying Baldock, and that is where Basham has to switch off with Baldock so so that Chilwell can be occupied. Abraham backheels the ball through the 6-yard box across Basham and Baldock for Chilwell, but his shot is denied by Ramsdale from point-blank range. When we look to another example, it's Thiago Silva sliding the ball out to Chilwell, and you have Mount in the gap between Berge and Norwood making a run between Egan and Basham as Basham is sucked in by Werner's positioning. And when Chilwell lofts a pass beyond Berge and over Basham for Mount breaking into the box, the only issue that Chelsea encounter here is that Mount's first touch lets him down, which allows Egan to sweep up. And minutes later, it's Thiago Silva sliding the ball out to Chilwell, which pulls out Berge, and the Chelsea left back's able to clip the ball over Baldock for Werner, darting in between Baldock and Basham in the left channel. But as Egan comes across, Werner is forced to guide a first-time looping cross into the box that bounces because Ramsdale doesn't attack it, and Lowe's able to hold off Ziyech to ensure that Chelsea can't get a shot on goal. Still, the game's main theme here was the positioning of James, Kovacic, and Ziyech down that right-hand side, and how they were able to cause Sheffield United so many problems. When we look to the first example, it's Thiago Silva pushing forward beyond the Sheffield strikers, and that's where you see Kovacic pushing forward ahead of Stevens and Ziyech to Lowe's left as Silva slides the ball out to an unmarked James. James ends up pulling out Lundstrom and sliding it out to Ziyech while continuing his run into the right channel, and that creates space for Ziyech to cut across low, and with Kovacic occupying Stevens so he can't step, Ziyech is able to pick out Werner peeling off Baldock, but he can't control the cross as he nods it upwards. When we look to Tammy Abraham's opener, you have James in a narrow position sliding the ball across a late stepping Lundstrom for Ziyech in a deep right touchline position. Neither Lundstrom or Lowe look to step forward to apply pressure, and you have Kovacic once again beyond Norwood and Lundstrom occupying Stevens. But what ends up happening here is that Kovacic makes a run beyond Stevens, and Ziyech does locate it and clips the ball over the Sheffield United left center back for Kovacic in right half space. Issue that Chris Wilder's men encounter here is that Mount breaks forward as well in that midfield zone and runs in between Egan and Basham to take them out of the game, and Kovacic is able to pull the ball back for an unmarked Abraham to side foot his effort beyond Ramsdale. Shortly after that is Thiago Silva ahead of Conte and the Sheffield United forwards, and he locates Ziyech shifting across low. Kovacic is also between Norwood and Lundstrom, and that creates space for an unmarked James down that right channel. Thiago Silva switches play out to James, who brings the ball down and takes his touch beyond Low to deliver a ball across Stevens at the front post, but Egan clears it. There was a time where Zuma slid the ball across McGoldrick for James, which pulled out Low, and James was able to square the ball to Conte shifting laterally towards the right channel. And when Conte receives the ball, you could see Mount running beyond the Berge-Norwood gap into the Egan-Stevens gap. Conte slides the ball wide to Ziyech on the right touchline, and he pokes the ball beyond Stevens, who has to retreat for Mount down the inside right channel, but once again, Egan is able to come across to block his pullback. Shortly after the half-hour mark, it was Mount from that deep inside left position, switching out the ball to Ziyech, holding the right touchline. And as he awaits James's underlapping run beyond the stepping low that Lundstrom tracks, Ziyech is able to play the ball into the path of James, who fires a first-time low cross that's pushed away by Ramsdale. That ultimately resulted in the corner kick that put Chelsea ahead. But what we ended up seeing from Ziyech from those set pieces in that opening half was that he was able to cause Sheffield United problems. However, when we look to the second half, while Sheffield United did a much better job of having their midfield shuttlers step out to close Chilwell and James, initially what we ended up seeing was that their aggressive high press allowed Conte time on the ball, and he was able to play his Chelsea teammates into some good positions. Now, all the away side has to do here is have Norwood push higher up the pitch to close down Conte, or not have both McGoldrick and Brewster stepping towards the Chelsea center backs. You need one to step to the ball carrier and the spare forward stepping into the path of Conte to ensure that he can't get on the ball. When we look to the first example, you see Zuma sliding the ball to James, which pulls out Lundstrom, and he's able to simply square the ball to Conte, and while McGoldrick does attempt to track back, you have Lowe sucked into Ziyech dropping deeper on the touchline, line, and you witness Kovacic running beyond Stevens. And while Conte's pass is a bit short, Stevens ends up nodding the ball into the path of Kovacic, who's able to break into the box, but Basham does a good job of making a last-ditch challenge to prevent a Werner tap-in. Minutes later, it's James from his own half playing a short ball for an unmarked Conte, who side-foots a first-time pass between Norwood and Lundstrom for Kovacic breaking forward. Kovacic is able to break into Sheffield United's half and slide the ball between Baldock and Basham for Werner, but Werner is able to take his first touch into a good goal-scoring position. But as that half continued, it was Ziyech and James down that right-hand side that were able to kill off the game. In the build-up to the free kick that they won, it was Chilwell playing a cross-field switch to James, who is now able to push forward to run at low. James ends up sliding the ball square to Ziyech ahead of a stepping Stevens, and you also witness Osborne tracking back to provide cover. But even then, Ziyech's able to slide the ball across Osborne and low for James, and James was able to win a free kick. But seconds after that goal, once again, we end up seeing Ziyech's creativity and his range of passing. It was Conte who dispossessed McGoldrick to place the ball into the feet of Ziyech ahead of that halfway line, and what Ziyech ends up locating is Werner darting in between that Basham and Egan gap, and he clips a ball into the gap between the Sheffield United center backs, but Werner breaks free on goal and ends up chipping Ramsdale, but the ball falls inches wide of the net. Hi everybody, thanks for watching, and subscribe here for your latest tactical analysis and daily commentary on the InnerViews show. And if that wasn't enough, don't forget you could find more organic, unfiltered soccer/football analysis on the InnerViews podcast, the best soccer/football podcast in the world, available on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and any Android apps on your Android devices.